Yeah, I'm here. Nadine? Good evening.
Uh-oh. Got a little peacock there.
We'll be on in 2 minutes.
I believe we're on.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening on this as we lead into celebrating Juneteenth, which our audience knows, and our lead speaker, the Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, has been stalwart in guiding us over the years on the importance and emphasis of Juneteenth as people of African descent, and what it means to us, not generally and only in our daily lives, but more importantly, in the daily lives that we try to achieve while staying out of the criminal justice system. I learned an important statistic recently that in 1890, 25 years, anyone who was born right after the Civil War and turned 25 at the first census after slaves were freed, we were 12% of the population, but 30% of African Americans were incarcerated. And what that really means is that we have to connect the incarceration of African Americans back to the time of slavery, because certainly 30% of 12% of the population didn't happen in 25 years, because they were only 25 years old. And there were a lot of people much older than 25 years old in the system. So we have to tie the incarceration of African American people back to slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act, which deputized everyone in America who was considered of European descent, thus white, deputized them and empowered them to not just capture any African American that they believe should be in slavery but was not in slavery, but to return them to that state of slavery. So the American policing system, when it came to African Americans, was premised, in my view, and I think in the Assemblywoman's view and others, on a capture and return model, and capture and return to chattel slavery. And you come to the 13th and 14th Amendment that resulted from the Civil War, and as the Assemblywoman likes to make sure everyone is aware, it's conditional. That freedom from slavery is conditional. Conditional on not being incarcerated again, but again, not being returned to what? Chattel slavery. So with that introduction, I'll first ask the Assemblywoman to make an introductory statement from that vantage point, and we'll turn next to our esteemed attorney in the community who deals with a lot of these issues.
So thank you so much, Yolan. You definitely, in speaking on that, are a woman after my own heart. One of the things that, we recognize for Juneteenth, I was proud to find that, I know that I'm a direct descendant of slavery. But, my cousins down in South Carolina and in Georgia did the research, and we even have been able to trace our heritage back to my great-great-great-grandfather, whose name was Guinea Charles. And so, being in this moment and celebrating Juneteenth and recognizing how important this moment is to American history is an honor and a privilege to just, be alive in this moment. And then to be the chair of the Election Law Committee, in this moment where we are working on, making things easier with respect to accessing the franchise, something that had been denied to us and then given to us and then taken away from us. And then also recognizing that this is a liberation moment. And so we are each sort of abolitionists, even in our own right. And so we are not necessarily just reading history, but we are creating it in our own space. there has to be present day Harriet Tubmans and Frederick Douglasses. We can't just have these folk be remnants of our past without understanding that their spirit still is alive in us, and that we have to give dignity to their experience by carrying the torch, and taking up the arms that they left for us. And so this is why we're doing this. We know that it may have taken us 400 plus years to get to this point, but all of the rights and privileges and responsibilities and accessibilities that we have now, we don't have them in perpetuity, so it will take an eternity for us to protect them. And so thank you, Yolan, for participating in this particular session. And Ken, this is our second year doing this, and so I look forward to all of the great work that we're going to be able to do together, and continuing to bring forth the charge for the people who are watching this, to be able to recognize, like, the really and truly the part that we all play, and recognizing how important Juneteenth is. And one of the things, I'll end here is, the idea around Juneteenth was the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, but Juneteenth wasn't celebrated until 1865, which was after the 13th Amendment was actually passed, but it was prior to it being ratified by the states. But it was already 2 years that had gone by. And these folk in Galveston, Texas, didn't even know, what their rights were at that moment. And so many people are released into the community each and every day. Again, I had mentioned that 25,000 people were being released in my district, in the 55th Assembly District, which includes the neighborhoods of Brownsville, Eastern York, Crown Heights, East Flatbush, Cypress Hills, and Bed-Stuy. And so many of them, of that 25,000 over 5 years, are just sort of given a Metro card, if they're even given a Metro card, but without any real reality about what it is that they even have access to, or even recognizing that they have the access to even vote, even if they're on parole. And so, again, I'll turn it back over to you. I look forward to the spirited conversation that we're going to have in this regard. So thank you.
You're more than welcome, because we need to know and let the community know and celebrate you and the work that you do and the work that you've done for bail reform, decriminalizing cannabis and marijuana, and the whole idea of criminalization of Black folk started when that was the methodology that the Europeans had to use to justify their brutality of capturing and putting us into chattel slavery, and creating a narrative that we were lesser than in terms of our intelligence, and accessible to them in terms of our agency, that they can consume that agency and control our bodies. So as we move I want to take this opportunity to introduce Ken Montgomery and have him make his opening statement in the context of that which we're discussing today, and then we can move on to more in-depth. So Ken, welcome. Tell us a little bit about your work and what you do in the community and how this ties into liberating folk.
Thank you, Doctor, for having me. Well, what I do on a daily basis is I'm a federal and state criminal defense attorney. I represent people not only in New York, but I represent people who are charged with the death penalty statute in other states across this country. I represent people charged with terrorism, you name it, in the federal system. That's what I do. And equal in state. I started out as a prosecutor, not because I like prosecution, but because it was a decision that was made at the time, leaving law school, to work for the side that is responsible for our oppression. And that is much deeper than that, obviously, but that experience opened my eyes to some things that I wouldn't have had information on if I didn't. Not to justify that, but that was a trajectory in my career. And after that, I've been doing federal work. obviously regular federal criminal defense and state defense since 2001. Tried maybe, I don't know, at least 60 to 70 trials for certain, jury trials at this point in my career. But I'm here, and I have an experience and a relationship to the oppression that we see in our courtrooms. The courtrooms that we deal with are at the vanguard of our oppression. We wouldn't have this level of oppression if the legal system wasn't complicit in it. That's one. I see that on a daily basis. We have to think about, as you said, the perception of people of African heritage in this country, and what that perception, how it's been used in a narrative to paint us. When you think of crime in America, when you think of violence, you think of us. And it's really counter to history. When you study American history, for a large portion of American history, the bad guys were cowboys or Europeans with Tommy guns and organized crime. In a very short period of time, the animus and the contempt for Black people turned itself into the visualization of it, and the ability to market us as dangerous people, because at one point we were marketed as shiftless, moving our feet, shuffling and jiving. We quickly then became, from there, standing up for ourselves in the civil rights movement. That was criminal. That was criminalized, and from that criminalization, then came the marketing of our dysfunction, and the legal system supports that every day. And all the things that just was mentioned by the both of you are part and parcel of where we are today, and it's all connected.
So let me take this opportunity with that background to give you a little bit of information, more detailed on, there's a book that I read once called Representing the Race. And I always say that there are too little of us now, 50 years after the civil rights movement, that take up the mantle to represent the race. But Ken Montgomery, you're certainly one of them. Ken graduated from Fordham Law School in 1997. As you heard a little bit of the result, but he started out where he honed his skills as an assistant DA in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. And what he meant when he said he worked for the system that incarcerated us, because a lot of people don't realize that the DA system is part of the police system, or it works in tandem, right, Ken?
It's symbiotic relationship. It's intertwined. Absolutely.
It's intertwined.
And in this day and age, people have to get out of this mode of celebrating politicians in general and people in general, entertainers and whoever, and really look at their purpose, but particularly painting law enforcement agencies as the curators of criminal justice reform. That's right. Kind of diabolical when you think about it.
Exactly. So let me tell you a little bit more about this, remarkable young man. Ken worked in the red zone, which covered high crime areas in the north section of Brooklyn, including East New York and Flatbush. He worked in the sex crimes unit, the juvenile designated felony unit, grand jury and investigations unit, the complaint room, and the violent gang bureau. After leaving the prosecutor's office in 2001, and I have to say, a lot of us as lawyers, we have to a lot of times cut our teeth in the system that has taken advantage of our people, because that's what's there. And that's what they teach us in law school as the control system, until we have the knowledge to understand how to defend our people or protect our people in this system. But Ken started his own law firm specializing in criminal and civil rights litigation. In 2001, he's talented and well-respected. He's a talented and well-respected criminal defense attorney in both the federal and state courts. He has defended clients charged with federal capital murder, terrorism, drug conspiracy, racketeering, and other serious crimes. As a trial attorney, he has litigated over 100 criminal trials as both a prosecutor and defense, securing over 70 not guilty verdicts I mean, that you have to know is a huge accomplishment, because at every turn of the trial, Ken, you had to get around a system that was intent on putting your client in jail, right? You got to figure that out. Throughout his career, he successfully represented several clients in high-profile and criminal matters. He successfully litigated several states and federal excessive fort claims and 1983 claims, which are discrimination claims. We all know our Assemblywoman and the leadership that she's provided, but I don't know if a lot of people know that she is in her own right an excellent and leadership criminal defense attorney. And her passion is in the law, and her passion is in the courtroom. And she's taken that passion to Albany. So when the real issues come out about whether we do bail reform, get young people out of Rikers, do we need to, what level of decriminalization we need to do with cannabis, and even having to stand up and defend bail reform, she's been in the courtrooms and in the streets. So with that, I wanted to ask the Assemblywoman if she wouldn't mind providing us, from her vantage point, with a little bit of the history of the criminal justice system after slavery, as to educate us a little bit, and the audience and the viewers on that a little bit.
Well, awesome. So thank you again, Yolan. Well, today the United States has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. We incarcerate over 2.2 million people behind bars. And while Black Americans make up only 13% of the U.S. population, we represent 37% of that incarcerated population. We have to have a clear understanding of how we got to this point in America and the state of New York, quite frankly. James Baldwin said that if anything is to change, if we are ever to end this racial nightmare and achieve our country, we must confront this system and the blighted history that it created. So again, we as elected officials, as community members, as community activists, we have to first acknowledge where we are. Their history teaches us that a lot of times when we begin our own history and the history of African Americans and Black Americans here in America, we tend to start our history where they dropped us off at, as opposed to where they picked us up from. And so we have a legacy of being kings and queens and rulers of countries and nations. And all of those things were stripped from us in order to try to erase or eradicate our DNA, as if it was not something that was just so special about our DNA that created that point of leadership within us. And so the way that, of course, they were able to execute on that general plan was by creating laws and systems that are designed intrinsically to get us down, right? And so we have to have that understanding, and we have to confront this. Not having fairness and justice and equity in our court system is nothing new, and is ingrained in the fabric and history of this country. After the 12 years of the Reconstruction era, a group specifically designed to roll back the advances of ex-slaves was established. And we know what that system was. It was called the Ku Klux Klan and that particular organization. Redemption was an organized effort by white merchants, planters, businessmen, and politicians that followed Reconstruction. Redeemers employed vicious racial violence and state legislation as tools to prevent Black citizenship and equality promised under the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Quite frankly, there was something that of course, everyone is reading the amazing book entitled Caste, and one of the laws that was mentioned in that particular situation was about trying to participate in the employment workforce in the industry of skilled labor. And when they talked about how they've been able to keep people out of skilled trades, one of the things that they said was that any Black person who wanted to be involved in skilled trades had to go before a federal court in order to get permission to practice in that particular trade. In addition to that, they had to pay a fee in order to pay for the license to participate. Does that sound familiar to anyone, out here? It does to me. It's called MWBE, right? And so there's a sister out here who calls even the MWBE plan the May We Be Equal Please plan. And so again, although we are living in these societies where there are these laws and situations that have been created, they're continuing to be perpetuated even today. And of course, the most sinister crime that I can think of is the whole idea of vagrancy. And quite frankly, the vagrancy is basically the crime of being unemployed. And so that really connects us to the fight that we had to go through about bail reform. Of course, the Constitution dictates that bail should not be punishment for a crime. It shouldn't be excessive. However, we see certain situations where that is the reality, and that most people, even throughout the state of New York, have been given bail in order to keep them incarcerated, as opposed to being and utilizing the true tenet for which bail was designed, in order to keep people in an area to ensure that they are going to return back to court. And quite frankly, most people come back to court because you don't get those 2.2 million people who are incarcerated because they have absconded from their requirements. And so when we fought against bail reform, I mean, the things that, I even remember being called, I know at one point in time, I thought nigger was just something that being called a nigger by a white person was just something I saw on TV or something that I heard about, until I actually felt it. Like they were typing it in Zooms that we were on. They were sending it as messages to my office. And even at one point in time, I took all of those messages and I plastered them all across the front door, because I was watching how they were taking something that was designed as a liberation opportunity and flipping it on its head. And the thing that troubles me the most is that our own people are even adopting the conversation and the rhetoric that they're using in order to continue the system of bail and keeping people incarcerated before they're even convicted. And our own people are saying the minute there's a shooting, oh, it's because, someone was released on bail reform. No, there were certain accommodations that were made with respect to bail to ensure that people who are situations where were bail eligible are still eligible. But it didn't stop so many courts and judges from saying, you know what? We're not going to lock any of these people up, and we're not going to give anyone bail, even when there are situations that still required or still fit in the bail eligible buckets. And the only reason why we still had those buckets, because there were people who were fighting vociferously in order to make sure that we kept bail. But we also provided all of these other opportunities where people would have to do regular check-ins. They would have to make telephone calls to let people know that, they're still around. And of course, the most I guess I'll say egregious form of bail, other than money bail and keeping people incarcerated, was the idea of the ankle bracelets. Because I wanted to make sure that we didn't turn physical incarceration into e-incarceration. And so now we're just sort of, changing out one thing for the other. But of course, it's important right now, in order to see that we have to be tough on crime. And being tough on crime means that we have to incarcerate more and more Black young people. And I don't know how, as Ken said, we got, the dynamics of this whole circumstances change. Like when I think of even the history of Brownsville, when I Google Brownsville and we talk about crime in this community, I pick up a lot of different things, including the Amboy Street Boys, a number of reputed mob situations that were taking place, here in early America. And so, how those dynamics change. It really is about, of course, the media. We don't control it, and so whenever it is that we see it, it almost gives the impression that it's only us. And some people say justice or just us. And so, of course, the decades that followed, this sort of tough on crime politics with racist undertones produced, among other things, harsh drug and mandatory minimum sentencing and laws that we recently just had to overturn. There was still a situation with convict leases that ended only in the 20th century to be replaced by chain gangs, or in other situations, they're being replaced by people who are on work release programs. And so, whatever the dynamics are, there's so many things that we are seeing that, when we think about in the history of our court system and in the criminal justice system, the laws, the language, and everything just sort of mimics one another. And so we have to know and understand our own history and the history of the enslavement and the incarceration, and how that's a perpetuation of the enslavement of us, in order to really be able to have the tools that will be necessary in order to make sure that we are going up to Albany and button the system, and again providing a liberation movement where we are empowering and we are embracing our present by acknowledging our past and making sure that we will never go back to a point where we will be recreating the ugliness and the dirtiness of slavery among us. But we always have to recognize that that same system that we read about, that we saw in Roots, is the same system that we're living in here today. The only thing that separates myself sitting here amongst you in 2021 and Kizzy from Roots, or Kenneth from my great-great-great-grandfather, Guinea Charles, is that one particular document, which is called the Constitution. And again, as Yolan mentioned, the only condition and the only exception that changes us from being freed individuals to going back to the truest form of slavery is participating in the criminal justice system. And so again, as we acknowledged even yesterday, one of the greatest quotes that I heard, of course, was from Harriet Tubman, when she acknowledged that she freed a lot of folk, and she put herself on the line, and she, and those other people put themselves on the line as well. But they were like, okay, well, you freed all of these individuals. How do you feel about that? You must be so proud of yourself. And she said, of course, I could have freed so many more if they had only known that they were slaves. And so we have to, even today, even in this moment, recognize how fragile this system is, and how fragile even we are as Black people living in America, no matter where you are. Because again, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, you may have come on different boats, but we're all in the same ship now. And so it's fragile for you, it's fragile for me, and we have to make sure that we are armed with the knowledge, the skill, and the expertise by which to continue to make sure that we are fighting against this system, that we are having the movements and the moments to make sure that history doesn't continue to repeat itself. And so when folk are out marching for George Floyd, and when folk are out marching against police brutality, and we're saying defund the police, we're not saying, defund the police because people don't want policing to exist in America, or definitely in New York. But when I got police officers walking up and down Rockaway Avenue on horses, reminding us of the ugliness of our past, that's the thing that we need to be defunding. And so again, we need to put the resources within the situations that they need to be in our schools, in our systems, so that we are creating adults who are, participating in the franchise, who are participating in our economy, and who are participating in our politics here in our nation. And so again, thank you so much for your participation, even in this particular event. And I look forward to continuing in this dialogue with you.
Well, let's continue this dialogue, because you touch on so many key points. the most important of which is the fragility. I want people to focus on what the Assemblywoman said. A lot of us, we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're mothers, we're teachers, we're middle class, we're lower class, we're nurses' aides, we're running around, buying a house, getting a new apartment, getting married. We forget, we don't pause about the fragility of our condition. So I thought it might be important before we go to continue, so much to talk about, but let me read to you the Fugitive Slave Act. We won't go back to 1619, which we should. But the Fugitive Slave Act empowered citizens, all citizens that were not Black, to assist in the recovery of escaped slaves. Now, nobody had no tag or star or nothing on their body saying, I'm an ex-slave. All you got is the color of your skin, and they just, right, Assemblywoman? You just walking, you're not on a plantation, and you're not, so they figure you must be escaped. And if they were unwilling to assist or aid a fugitive or aided a fugitive in escaping, like the abolitionists, they were subject to fines and prosecution. This was a U.S. congressional law. And then, even in enacting the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment, what the Assemblywoman was referring to, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party should have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. So even there was never a complete absolving or recognition by the white community and the white system on which the current police system was built, that we were not inherently criminal. And so you come back to the question of bail, which is, I believe, I'm not a criminal justice attorney. I didn't want to waste time on the little bit time we have on this important topic to tell you about what I do, because it's not relevant to this moment. I've just been honored to ask to moderate this session between people with much more experience about this. But you come back to where we started, which is you get picked up, put in a squad car, or a police officer pulls you over. And I tell people all the time, they're capturing a fugitive. If you look at the stance of anybody today who's dealing with a person of African descent in policing, they take that stance. And your first way out of being incarcerated is bail. So, Ken, would you give us a little bit of your experience in the difficulty and the challenges, even with bail reform today, in getting that privilege or right, I'm not sure which one it is, in place for people who are picked up and incarcerated?
All right. I will. One thing I just want to add on to what you were talking about, and what the Congresswoman was talking about, was
he is going to go to Congress.
Assemblywoman, I'm sorry, you're right. Not in existence, right? The fragility portion, something else that we don't often talk about a lot when we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act and those laws in that vein, is the tools that were created in American society that supported whiteness and white supremacy and white nationalism. And what something like the Fugitive Slave Act really did, when you think about it in hindsight, was it opened up a window of a doorway for Europeans who weren't considered white necessarily, and to get into whiteness. And what I mean by that specifically is Irish Americans and even Italian Americans. The Fugitive Slave Act, when you do the history, many Italians supported that act. I mean, Irish people supported that because it gave them an opportunity to enter into whiteness. So these things are practically destroying our lives and preventing us from having meaningful, purposeful lives and being complicated human beings just like everyone else. And on the other, it's instilling a brand in Western culture that always has us at the bottom of the social totem pole. and a social construct. And even when you look at this thing that America loves to talk about, which is the Constitution, this piece of paper, that piece of paper is infused with racism. The 3/5 concept was off of the perception of Africans, which led to this electoral system, which leads to, even in this century, we're watching the dangers of an electoral system that's constructed and birthed off of inequity. But back to bail. Bail
No, you were doing fine, because I think you made the connection for us. So thank you. Continue.
Yeah. But bail, right? Bail is a very, what's dangerous in American society, particularly when it comes to Black people, is that our pain and our dysfunction has been commodified and hashtagged and profited off of. That's why I really respect the Assemblywoman for having the real genuine conversations and really having the genuine relationships and doing the genuine work, because I firmly believe at this point it's the people who are going to have to change this, and it's going to have to be a cocktail of several people like yourselves, both of you, others, known and unknown, anonymous, coming together and saying enough is enough. We're drawing a line in the sand. But bail, so bail is interesting, because you have to think of bail in two parts, and so it's not becomes this cliche term. You have the federal bail statute, and you have the state bail application in state, right? In the federal system, there is no criminal justice reform in the federal system. There's no movement. There's nothing about reforming our federal criminal justice system that it's an algorithm. It's really not an application in humanity. It's really an application in humanity, and in my opinion, in the most negative regards. But it's an algorithm when you have a system and institution that wins 97% plus, maybe even higher all the time. So
can you expand on what you mean by that? 97%?
I mean that for for instance,
don't know.
So a law enforcement agency such as the U.S. Attorney's Office, which depending on your jurisdiction depends on how many U.S. Attorney's Office you have in your country, in your county, or your state, rather. They operate in they function primarily through the work of the FBI, the DEA, ATF, and other federal agencies. And that's how they bring cases. They build cases. So when they're building cases, they're checking the statutes, the case law, the past law, the precedent of other cases to make sure that they have what they need to sustain a conviction, because they also realize that they have the rules of evidence. And they also have a system that normally jurors are kept as far away from the defense and the presumption of innocence as possible. Meaning that if the United States comes for you in this society that we live in, instead of people being suspect of the United States with all of the dastardly, hypocritical positions that they found themselves in, not just domestically or internationally, the average American citizen wants to believe everything that Uncle Sam says, Team America says. So, you have that stigma, which dwindles away the presumption of innocence. And then you have the pragmatic function of picking jurors, which means having a conversation with the community about this particular crime or issues in this case. When you remove that element, and then when you have the rules of evidence, and when you have the majority of federal judges are all former prosecutors, you have a algorithm that is slanted towards conviction, where people only believe the system works if there is, in fact, and indeed a conviction. So when I say that conviction rate, I mean the cases that are brought that aren't pled out, because the majority of cases in the federal system are pled out because the federal sentencing guidelines, where the judges, they used to didn't have the power. These guidelines were advisory, but now, not advisory, mandatory. They're now advisory. But they still abide by them. and they don't really apply 3553A and the social issues that someone who's a descendant of a slave would have in a system that is sustained by that person's oppression. Meaning, judge, you don't sit off on that bench if this society didn't make sure that that person you're judging had a very challenging, difficult life that you could never compare to. So your wealth and your affluence to that bench is solely connected to that oppression of that person who you are sentencing. And so I'm going off on a tangent, but
well, you're not.
That goes in,
back to bail reform, but it's relevant.
That goes into the psyche of what people think when they see a black or brown person accused, simply accused, not wonder what they did, but I wonder what now. Here's a distinction I tell jurors all the time: walking in the courtroom and looking at somebody and saying, "Yo, I wonder what they did," is not applying the presumption of innocence. Walking in that courtroom and saying, "I wonder what they're accused of," is being in tune with these so-called principles in America. And that's a challenge for most people,
So now I'm going to nudge you back to bail, although that was
right,
really
bail. All right, so bail.
No, you did the right thing, but I just think, because I'll pick up on some of the things, but I want to just nudge you back to that. Because I think,
bail.
But I think, I think though that Ken brought up, a really good, so everything that he was talking about really connects in. But when he mentioned the algorithms, right? And so they're utilizing the federal system, they're utilizing the state system as well. And quite frankly, who does it in the state system is the New York City Criminal Justice Agency, which is a pretrial services not-for-profit organization. And so it's like, now it's like we're the ones who's funding this whole system, which is like, skewed in one particular direction, because some of the questions that gets asked, where do you live? Suppose I don't have any place to live because the housing system, the housing apartment that I lived in said that I can't live there anymore because if I continue to be in my mother's lease, her rent is going to go up, but I can't get a job in order to help her pay that. So she took me off the lease, but I live there, but I can't say that I live there because I don't want her to get into a situation. Or they may ask, how much schooling did you go to? Or I went to school up to the 8th grade because by the time I tried to drop myself into high school, I realized that high school wasn't something that was available for me. So I never dropped out. I just never dropped in. Right. And so when you start asking these questions, which again, they're all connected to poverty and living a life with a lot of different social ills that you have to bump up against. And these are the questions which determine whether or not you get bail or not. Again, it's a system that's designed for your incarceration, which is, as Attorney Montgomery said, is commodified in order to create this situation where you have to be behind bars. And so I'm sorry, Ken, for jumping in. But when you hit those algorithms, like that just hit home.
But
let me add an algorithm, and I don't want you to forget your trend of thought that I've learned, and I defer to the two of you, but I think this is the moment to say it. I learned, there's a scholar out there that talked about, he documented for the first time the difference in policing of African Americans and African people coming out of slavery and immigrants who came into this country, and at the late 1800s, early 1900s. But to Ken's point, which included the Irish immigrants who first came in the 1800s, working in the coal mines and found a way to whiteness by participating in the Fugitive Slave Act. And when we talk about these things, they say, let's not talk about critical race theory. And you come to the early 1900s, and what happened is, what he said was, there was actually in the court system in the early 1900s, if an Italian immigrant or an Eastern European immigrant or even an Irish immigrant showed up in court, the prosecution was allowed and welcomed and invited to present all the social conditions that put that person in front of the court to take it into account. When it came to Black folk, oh no, that's just their nature. You can't talk about the fact that they may be having mental illness coming out of slavery, that they couldn't find their children, that they probably went apeshit because some plantation master, raped their wife and wives and stole their children, and oh, he was just acting crazy, lock him up. So it's very relevant. I'm glad you took us down that path, because bail as a lay person, although I'm an attorney, seems to be your first opportunity to get out of the physical jail, right?
Mm-hmm,
so let's talk a little bit about your experience and guidance on that for us, and the challenges that still lie ahead to free up the system.
Well, it's getting bail, and the application of bail for a federal defendant is much more limited than a state defendant. The reason being, the federal statute is based on danger to the community and risk of flight. And there's certain crimes that are presumptively dangerous to the community, and there's certain acts that in your past that are presumptively viewed as automatically risk of flight, and clear and convincing evidence. This is different standard in the federal system. And unlike the state system, you don't actually put up money. You can put your house up, but some limited situations, but most of the time it's a promise to pay in the event that the person does not return in the federal system. So in the federal system, if you can convince and negotiate with the government, the U.S. attorney, more often than not, your person is going to not be detained, and they'll have some conditions that are set to ensure their presence, but they may get out. But some crimes, drugs, I've seen guys in federal system, drug cases, no violence, no bail, detention, and a bunch of other crimes under the umbrella. In the state system, you have an opportunity to argue more extensively for bail, particularly now, and even in the past you did. The issue with bail in the past, as in now, is the fact that these judges do whatever they want to do. They have the discretion and they apply it however they want. And to some degree on the federal level, they do the same as well. But, the issue on bail in the state level is you're essentially trying to convince a jurist, a judge, that your client can make it back to court. That's really what you're talking about. You're not trying a case.
How does that play out in real life when African Americans come into the system with the system having a presumption that they're inherently criminal and a danger to society? What challenges do that present for you?
Plenty and many. You just said something. Plenty and many. You just said something in the beginning of the program. I believe you quoted a percentage. I think I'm not certain, but I think I'm in a ballpark. I think we may represent 13 to 16% of this population, and we represent maybe 50 to 60% of the prison population. A prison population that is imprisons 25% of the world's prison population. We're overrepresented is an understatement. That when you're represented to that degree, you have a system that leads to that. Everything leads to
for that is what you're saying.
Yes, it's entertainment leads to that. It's horrible school system leads to that. Its economic system leads to that. Its healthcare system leads to that. Its poverty all of it leads to that. That has nothing to do with propensity. And that is, that's going back to the American hypocrisy, or the Western cultural European hypocrisy, where you can be so enlightened that you sit down and you ponder what is man, and in your conversation of what is man, you exclude another human being for hundreds of years, and you justify it because of how they suffer under your alienation and exclusion. That is insane. That's beyond intellect.
I was going to ask the Assemblywoman if she wanted to.
But Bell, here's the last thing on Bell. You're representing your client's narrative in a very short window, and you're convincing the judge based on their community ties, based on their lack of criminal history, or explaining their criminal history, explaining all the things in their background that presents itself as mitigation and not aggravation, and convincing the judge that this person can make it back to court. That's what you're doing as a lawyer, arguing bail.
Well, I guess you don't get a lot of bail for your clients because they just
get it.
Run.
I get some bail.
All right, you're good then. You're really good. Assemblywoman, do you want to, I know that bail reform is your passion and you've taken a lot of heat for it. But what is it that, in terms of solutions, that you put your marker down and even going forward that you'd like to see happen to continue to improve the system?
Well, so I guess at this point it's like bail is so 2000 and late, right? Because we've done that, but of course, folk are constantly trying to chip away at the bit on it. But now we've moved on. Of course, we just passed less is more, which of course deals with the system of parole, right? And when you are on parole, you still have that mantra that's over your head because your debt to society still hasn't been paid. And so you're still living in that, like you're a slave thing, right? And when you're in that position, just as when we think about slavery historically, there's certain, America isn't yours. It's almost like the Constitution doesn't necessarily apply to you because now whatever access to America and to American laws and jurisprudence that was denied to you as a slave is now still being denied to you, which is why, your address is what we say your address is. And you a human being, if we say you're a human being, and as Ken had mentioned, when we were being counted in the census, we weren't even being counted as full-fledged human beings. We're somehow, 3/5 of, the person who's standing next to us. And so, whenever it is, so when you're on parole, they have this thing that's over your head where if you just so happen to be on your way down to the parole office, right? You're like, yo, I know I got to get to this parole office because if I don't, they're going to violate me, but I don't have enough money by which to pay the car fare in order to get downtown. So I'm going to try to slide through this door and I'm going to jump the turnstile and then boom, you got an interaction with the police. And now you were trying to avoid being returned to jail to finish out your sentence from being violated, but you're still getting violated anyway because, again, you ain't have the money because you're on parole and nobody's going to hire you because when they ask you questions about what's your employment status and what's your background and they do these background checks, nobody's hiring you. So, again, it's all just so interrelated and interconnected into this whole one same system. And so, of course, we just did less is more, which basically says that at this point, just because somebody has this brief interaction with the police department doesn't mean that now they have to be ushered back upstate in order to undo all of the things that folk have been able to accomplish by getting them out on parole. And but we haven't done. We're not done yet. We still have a long way to go to end perpetual punishment, which is also another hashtag that, I'm very fond of. But then there's also the Clean Slate Act, right? And so at some point in time, when is enough enough? And you're able to say, you know what, I've done what I was supposed to do. I may have made some bad decisions in my past, but I need to now be able to move forward with my life. And I think that, we have to get clean slate again across the finish line, and hopefully also to see that the governor will actually sign less is more into law. And so, politics is not a spectator sport. We can't sit on the side, sit in our Zoom world and be looking at the screen and wanting to throw tomatoes or clapping when we feel good about something. We have to recognize that politics and is what we do. It's not just what we say. And so as a chair of the Election Law Committee, we just opened up also the opportunity for people who are presently on parole to register to vote and to vote. And so right now, I already told you, like, there's 25,000 people in my district that was released from 2015 to 2020. So there's 25,000 people that, we should be registering, and they should be voting, because your vote is your voice, as we will hear tomorrow during tomorrow evening's conversation. Your vote is your voice. The language of politics and numbers. So they see how many people are registered, they see how many people are out voting, and they're determining the resources that we have based on that census count, based on our voting age population, and quite frankly, based on our activities with respect to civics and voting in our present day society. And so I think that there's, again, we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go with respect to voting, parole, and other laws that we need to have change in American society and here in the state of New York.
I want to ask you, and I think is it fair to say, or is it rational for us to be saying that slavery has been abolished with everything we just talked about today? Because even those of us who have not gone into the system seem to be one stop away from going into the system. Is that one of the changes we need to look at? We all take comfort in the 13th Amendment, but is there work to be done there as well?
Well, look, I think we've already pointed out that slavery is not abolished. It is, but it isn't.
Right.
It is.
Is there legislative work to be done there?
Well, there's always legislative work. I think that needs to be done. Now, this could definitely be something that, could be, introduced into the system. And how do we get a constitutional amendment to be changed? Now, that's a challenge, that I'll put out there to our congressional members. But again, politics is not a spectator sport, and it's really on us to be able to provide them with the level of support that they need. Like, we're trying to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed, and quite frankly, that's like one of the easiest things that I think that could be accomplished. But that's a heavy lift, and so going in there and taking off this, with the exception of punishment for a crime, I think is a lofty agenda. It's a Black agenda. It's about time that we turn this power and purpose into our passion and our commitment, and into the politics of our day, and go down into these respective houses and start undoing some of these laws that continues to be a proverbial noose around our neck. And so yes, I think it's important for us to go and make sure that abolition is what it says, and not just some conditional idea, right?
Attorney Ken, I wanted to, if you can share with us, because I think our children have been made to be adults and men in the criminal justice system and in slavery, when for a lot of us, especially even 400-500 years on this side of the Atlantic, our young men, especially in our culture, wherever you find us, from Brazil to Canada, there are babies. And I just want you to share with us some of the challenges you see they're facing in the criminal justice system, and what reforms you think might be needed to attend to their needs as we talk about this broader picture. But there, if you could share some of that and some lessons there.
Absolutely. I think the overall lesson that I walk away with every day is that these problems that our young men are facing, from teenagers to 20 to 50s on up, is our problem. And we have to address it as such. And addressing it starts in our communities, our blocks, our neighborhoods. We have to change a lot within our own community. That's my overall, what I leave with. What they face is a oppressor that crushes ants with sledgehammers. And what they find themselves in is beyond their ability to understand. Most of them, not all of them. Most of them is beyond, and it has nothing to do with intellect. A lot of them, they have been conditioned and programmed in the American system where they do not understand what's at play. So that's the biggest challenge as an attorney, educating someone who has been miseducated and someone who does not even understand their own complicity in their own demise. That's a challenge in and of itself. That's a separate challenge. The challenge with the legal system is that you do not have a diversified group of people. And I'm not even talking about race or ethnicity or any of that. I'm talking about intellect. I'm talking about life experiences. You don't have a diverse group of people making a determination on social behavior and really acknowledging history. And as a result, these young men, their stories, their narratives, are not being told. That's the biggest challenge, is that their stories are not being told in the legal system by the people with the skill set, or who should have the skill set to tell their stories, because no one wants to deal with race. So their stories aren't even being told. So that's a challenge. And then you have just judges and prosecutors who find it to be a personal affront to be reminded of what their story is. So that's another challenge. So beyond the laws and the rules of evidence, which is the biggest challenge, you have these social norms and conditions and you have these wounds from within our community that double up the complexities and the challenges. The ultimate answer is for the stakeholders in our community of all different experiences, ages, life experiences, professional experiences, spiritual experiences, intellectual experiences, creative experiences. All of these, the core of that needs to come together. And it's not about scale. Are we going to sell this and we're going to go to every neighborhood and sell it? No, it's about what's needed pragmatically in that particular community. And forget about money. It's creating and constructing the ideology to help these young people and the community have sustainable lives in a sustainable, pulsating community where people the success isn't leaving. The success is staying in and acknowledging some of the challenges. And saying, we in a society where they don't want to tell the truth about history, because that's what the critical race argument is about. It isn't even about that particular project. It's just the continued falsification of history in America. So they're being aggressive about it. Why isn't there an educational movement in the poor communities to take our children out of the schools, get retired and current educators, get concerned community members with skills who are teachers, they just not technically a teacher, and get them together and start building and using these empty spaces in these New York City Housing Authority buildings or these other structures and having school.
Put a village together.
School in a way that, because school, get out of the mindset of what a school is, a desk and a pencil and a paper. Have environments of learning. Life learning, social learning, math, astrology, whatever, but have those spaces. Why isn't there a movement to do that and take our kids out of these schools where you're dealing with these biased tests and biased administrators and biased this? You know what would happen if the community started doing that? You'll really see that this whole American facade is in fact what Patrice said. She didn't say this, but you said something about how America is fragile. I use your word fragility. But what I was talking about is this place is a house of cards. If there's anything that the coronavirus has shown us in this day and time, is that this place is a house of cards, and the slightest wind will knock all of this stuff down. So that being understood, we have known that. That's been our history in this short place here. Go to the source of liberation, which is education. Let's start educating our own kids, not just to being able to read a book, but having their own value system to get them out of European thought. Thinking out of European thought being their default. That's the problem. That's the default. That's the default if you're successful. That's the default if you can't find success.
Assemblywoman, you have your charge. I was wondering whether you had any particular questions that you wanted to pose to this esteemed attorney. I tell you, you have a lot to teach us. We need the first community space where you come and teach on a Saturday, because
I'm
we
with
have
that.
to learn from you on how to teach.
I'm with that.
Your experiences are valuable. Assemblywoman, is there anything in particular you wanted to dialogue with him about in terms of your knowledge base? And you have your own knowledge in being in the system and being in the streets and being in the community.
Well, I mean, there's so much. Like this Zoom could go all night if based on just like, where do we even begin? Like we mentioned.
I'm sorry. Assemblywoman, I
ahead.
just want to say one final thing,
Go
and it's
ahead.
real.
It ain't final, but you just keep going.
The dysfunction is being sold. So one of the hardest challenges is our kids are given a false narrative by these entertainers and these entertaining corporations and aggregators and affiliates, and they are taking that dysfunction and they are internalizing it. And that is really scary for me to watch as a young man who grew up in this spectacle and watched this industry grow to make billions, and how now our dysfunction is sold. And these kids from good homes, kids parents who are good parents who work hard, as if parents who don't got a job haven't been through some stuff and don't work hard. But you're finding all those kids in the same place because that dysfunctional black cool guy is the bread and butter. And our kids are being programmed towards that on a daily basis. And that's a tremendous challenge as well. And I'm out. I'm not saying that.
Well, I think the responsibility, which is one of the things I was saying that we should have. I know I used to work for an esteemed attorney, Londell McMillan, who's an entertainment lawyer. Also the owner of the Source magazine, and it's sort of family of entertainment and media products. And we have to figure out how we can incorporate him into this conversation as well, because I remember working with him. He had the Artist Empowerment Coalition, and trying to provide a modicum of standards and dignity even to the music industry, where we see a system that's sort of based on stripping us of that. When you were mentioning about how certain groups became white, and the history of enslavement and racism, and as Yola mentioned, critical race theory in our laws, but we always had the media to kind of help perpetuate the things that were going on, because that's what sort of allowed society to accept the wrong that we were doing, or we are doing, to an entire group of people that we still see. And so when we were watching the images of what it looked like to be a Black woman, and that image was Aunt Jemima, right? And so anytime you saw a Black woman, that's the thing that came into your head. That same level of imagery, still exists today. And, and some of it even gets based on, how we see ourselves, and also how our own, even let's say for women, at least, how our own Black men see us, right? And I was just having this conversation today with someone about women who are, doing these sort of body enhancement surgeries. And, we got, young ladies walking down the street with the biggest behinds that I've ever seen. And I'm like, I don't understand this. Like, first of all, where they're getting the money from to do this, when, folk are still living in this system of poverty. And why are we doing this? But it's like, every time I look on TV, I'm like out here trying to compete with all that stuff I see too, because I want to be cute. I want to be sexy. I want to, have people walking down the street and saying, hey, shorty, to you as well, because though we fight, and though we have to be sort of lionesses at home, in the workplace, in community, in society, like, we still deserve to be pink too. Now, that's a whole other conversation with respect to being a Black woman in America, and sort of what the ideas that are being espoused about our bodies, and what it means to be a Black woman, and why it has to be all of these sort of physical attributes, is beyond me, right? And so, even again, and we can also talk about the sort of glory with respect to gang affiliation, whether it be glory or whether it be just sort of something that is not necessarily a great thing. Now, quite frankly, of course, New York City determines that you're participating in a gang when it's 3 or more of you that are congregating together. Whether or not you're having a conversation, or you're playing chess, or whatever it is that you're doing, you're considered to be in a gang just by definition of the fact that there's 3 Black guys standing outside on the corner. But we also have this thing called Amir Khan in throughout our history here, particularly even in Brownsville, where folk recognize that even gang membership is a system. And that system has hierarchy, it has leadership. And when you go in and you give those folk who are the leaders the tools to be able to say, you know what, you're going to go on this job, you're going to go on that job. They're building over here in this community. They don't have anybody over there who's Black and brown, who's working on this site. We're going to go over there. And then all of a sudden, the minute that, folk were organizing to turn that gang membership, that gang affiliation into something productive, then they started to create laws that said that even now that was illegal. And then again, the whole idea about gangs and any groups of individuals or groups of young people automatically get changed to what we see in society about, or in movies about, what gang membership, gang affiliation, and gang relationships are. When at the end of the day, some of our babies they're growing up like participating in a gang as a 6-year-old is just as as
it's a fraternity.
being,
It's a fraternity to them.
It's not even a fraternity. It's a way of life.
It's a way of life. It's a buddy system.
It's a way of life, right? And so when you're 5 years old and your mom is in one set and your dad is in the same set, where do you think you're gonna go? Even when you try to get out of it, that's just it just becomes a part and parcel of who you are. And it is not necessarily a terrible thing, but it's society makes it that way, because anytime there's a situation that takes place, look, we even have motorcycle groups who are, most of the people who participate in this particular group are police officers or in law enforcement. But it still doesn't stop the police from raiding the location, for saying that they're in a gang, for saying that there's, all sorts of, criminality that's taking place in that situation. And so the minute that we begin to congregate, the images that the media presents about just who we are always just, creates a system that it has to be negative, as opposed to looking at the positive things that can come out of a lot of that. And so we also, as Ken said, have to recognize that we have to control the poison that's going into the minds of our kids. Right. Yeah. And at this point, I can't even keep up, because there's Roblox, there's YouTube, there's this and there's that. Everything. And while I'm trying to control Cablevision, she ain't even checked. My daughter's not even checking for TV.
But what I was going to say is, I can envision a space and time where when you start controlling your educational space, let's just say you had a community centers. Let's just say it became trendy to have community centers in Brooklyn, in the Brownsville, and the East New York that cater to education, the arts, and politics. Mm-hmm. And that was the hub. When you get that hub going, eventually those young people, they're going to start, when they start really understanding what's going on, they're going to look at these entertainers and these entertaining corporations and these people who are distracting them, as you said, daily, all the time. They're going to look at them as corny, as like, yo, it's not even cool to get a deal with those people anymore. Yo, the arts is right here where we at, in this
everybody wants to be aspirational. Every human being
Yeah, they have to start looking at those people as
You know,
affiliates of their
aspirations
oppressor.
in different ways. Yes.
They
In the
didn't.
little time that we have, I think we have 10 minutes, and we've imposed on you so much, and we did, and it fits in because we wanted to talk about technology and the criminal justice system.
Okay.
When we talk about that, we think about how technology is used to, incarcerate or arrest, but from what you've all just described, it includes all the images. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh man, doctor, every case that I'm involved in, and I have about maybe 30 to 40 federal cases that I'm involved in, almost 80% to 90% of my cases, both federal and state, have a social media element to it. A Snapchat picture, a text on Facebook, a message to the ops, a recitation of the oath of your gang, a picture of you throwing a sign, wearing a clothes, symbolizing something. Our kids are smitten by it. And they don't even, and the technology, I look at it like this: the rule of law is stopped with search and seizure. You can't come in my house. You can't search my car. You can't do that. Those things have become cliche. The technology has become so powerful that there aren't any elements in the American rule of law to tackle that. So your rights are even being trampled on even more. So the only way off actually is to push back against that technology, at least as to that regard, because it's getting to the point, state district attorney's offices, because of the technology, because everything is on a grid, everything is on a video, everything is on a server. Their numbers are reaching now federal numbers because they now have more resources to investigate. And when you have more resources, when the image is that the black person doesn't have the presumption of innocence, back to the Dred Scott decision by Taney, black man has no rights that a white person is bound to respect. When you really think about that, Taney was a lot more right about American society than we like to give him credit for.
Well, that's a nice segue into closing out. It's unfortunate that we can't have this conversation all evening, and I implore the assemblywoman to hopefully we don't have to wait until the next Juneteenth because there's so much to talk about.
I know because we were just having a conversation that techno racism is a thing even in and of itself, right? Because we got facial recognition, and how with facial recognition it recognizes black women as men, right? And then, or else how many of us, when we go to these sinks in these public places and we're trying to wash our hands and we got to act like we're sort of DJs because the censor can't even tell that it's a human being who has their hand under there. And so, not only is the system with individuals institutionalizing personally racism, whether or not they want to acknowledge it or not, it exists, but they're putting those same racist ideologies into the technology. And so it's like, we just really, we cannot win. We're fighting back against, facial recognition in our schools. We're fighting back against facial recognition in our housing, but guess what? It's up and down our streets.
It's everywhere.
And so, yes. And so again, as Kim mentioned, this is, so now, they don't have to put out, a sign that says $50 reward, for Ultimo to come to be brought back to the slave owner. They got computers and technologies that are doing, the work of these sort of fugitive slave catchers anyway.
And then send out the electronic dog to just do the rest of it.
Don't even get me started on that. So again, I think that we of course we've come so far, but we really just have such a long way to go. I don't know if we've received any questions, Nadine, from Facebook or any of our other social media platforms, but I will leave that, to
There's
you guys.
I just saw a question. The question is from Linda Wilson. May I read it out? Why are our kids smitten by Nadine? Do you see it better than I? Why are kids are smitten by that culture? Well, I think it's a culture that you, Ken, was describing, the culture.
It's because they're inundated with it, and everybody's invested in it. Think about it. They have these computers that we call phones that they can get hit every day with something concerning that lifestyle. That like they're inundated with it. It's a part of the American pop culture. What kid doesn't want to be cool? And it's unfortunate that our masculinity is found through entertainment, and it's unfortunate that our womanhood, black female womanhood, is found in American entertainment. It shouldn't. It should be the reverse. It should be emanating from our communities, from within, not from outside. But that's an unfortunate reality of capitalism. Listen, capitalism realizes that, when you take the black experience from America, what do you have? So now when you take
that's a whole other Assemblywoman, would you promise us that if there's a space between now and Juneteenth or right after, I'm serious, that is such a, we tend to, because of the woes, we have to be mired in the woes, not to minimize them. But you're absolutely right. In the midst of doing all this criminalization, fugitive capturing, dehumanization, chattel slavery, incarceration, the product from which they've benefited, from everything on how to grow rice to how to make music to how to turn furniture. And I think that's a whole different topic that maybe we should put on our list for Juneteenth.
I know. It's like, what? Don't even mention furniture, because then you reminded me of what's that? There's a state agency that, is built only around selling furniture that's made by people who are or who are incarcerated, and most of our government agencies, purchase from it, and then you look under the bottom of the furniture and it's like, created by, anyway. So I mean, that's a whole other conversation. So I do agree that we need to come back to this. I think Ken has dropped some jewels on us today that really, it just brings about all of these other things that we just don't talk about, right?
Likewise.
And quite frankly, talking about it provides the education to the focus. If Facebook and Instagram is where they are, then this is, again, the type of platforms that we need to be able to speak to our folks, to be able to say, you know what? When I do hear that they say, they're looking for a guy with a blue hoodie, blue jeans, and white, Air Force Ones, that it reminds them so much of, an ad for the Fugitive Slave Act when they were out talking about, bring us a guy with blue corduroys, or whatever the circumstances were. And so this is the place, I think, where we really should be doing that. And so I agree that this is definitely something that we should be looking forward to. But here's another question that I want to bring up to see what Ken's thoughts are about, the criminal justice system and the perpetuation of slavery through our courts. What about these court-imposed surcharges?
Oh, I mean, those are all directly, anytime you're dealing with anything, in my opinion, and I'm not afraid to say it, but anything you're dealing with that has a capital component to it, capitalism, is going to travel down this road, and somewhere along the road, it's going to bump into racism and the effects of slavery. So when you have all these surcharges and these fines that, you have people who are traditionally, socially, politically, and economically alienated and academically alienated, and if they're not alienated, it's due to tremendous grit and sometimes luck and community. You're going to have a racial component, aspect to it. The Ferguson report, which is a book that talked about the uprisings in Ferguson, those same components, I would say, are right down on Skimmerhorn Street or Center Street or in Manhattan concerning the summons that are issued. When the last time you drove down the street and you seen the cops stopping, talking to a group of white men, or white teenagers, or had them outside of their car? You just don't see it. So that surcharge, not to go on that, but that surcharge and these fines they often have a disparate effect racially, that sometimes collides economically with class. So that's always at play.
Well, in the little time we have, I wondered first, Ken, if you wanted to, in 60 seconds, close us out with a encapsulation, and maybe some direction, and then the Assemblywoman. But before you do, I just want to thank you both for allowing me to moderate this amazing discussion.
Been great. Thank you.
I have learned a lot from you. I'm honored to have been asked to do this. And the Assemblywoman mentioned a Black agenda. We are on that path to define and craft and shape it. And I've learned a lot here tonight, this evening, to include in that as part of our immediate priorities in New York City, in New York State, and nationwide. So with that, I first turn it over to you, Ken. Attorney Ken Montgomery, if you would also give people your phone number and contact information.
Sure. Phone number is 718-403-9261. My email is ken@kjmontgomerylaw.com. I think I'm on Instagram as KJMPLLC and ESQ Montgomery on Twitter. My biggest thing, I ultimately would like to put myself out of business or be a part of something that puts me out of business, meaning lessening the need for criminal defense attorneys in our communities. And I think the way to do that is you have to go to the risk factors of what's producing that and producing that entryway into the criminal justice system. And at this point, we know it's socially, we know it's academics, we know it's culturally. So I would love to see what I talked about earlier about that renaissance in our communities concerning culture and education, our version of education, of what's important to us, our value system. I think that will go a long way into turning our kids' eyes from the glowing, glazing light of American capitalism that not often, its goal is to destroy us. And that I don't mince words with that. So I would love to see that. I would love us to instill accountability instead of looking for heroes and martyrs and people who often become grifters or the grifting group. I would love for us to redesign our concept of power, and power isn't some hierarchical thing, but more a horizontal thing that incorporates the real stakeholders and has an accountability process. I think the ultimate goal is to control our ecosystem in an ever-changing, difficult world that is becoming even more difficult. And I think this is a call to arms at this time. America is it's an empire. Empires don't last forever. We have been responsible for this empire and its entrance onto the world stage because of us. At some point globally, because what's happening to us here, as mentioned earlier, is happening in Brazil, is happening in parts of Colombia, South America, Central America, the continent, and Europe. Wherever we are, there is a system in place that everyone has bought into. We have to invest in innovating and creating our own system that's unique to us instead of, we have to respond, instead of reacting to this. And I would hope people get together and they start organizing and they start having those difficult conversations, but those difficult conversations often lead to simple solutions. And that's where we are at right now.
Well, thank you so much for that, Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, and chair of the Election Law Committee and all the other stuff that a lot of people don't realize that you do in Albany to save homes, to keep our children out of the prison system, to decriminalize cannabis, to tenants' rights, focus on people on public housing. You care so much about the quality of their life and their security and safety. I turn this over to you to close us out.
Thank you.
Give us your charge.
I know we didn't really even get to go into murder, the legalization of cannabis in New York State, and what that's going to be like, and when people, you get stopped by the police because you're not supposed, you can walk and smoke, but you cannot drive and smoke. and there's still circumstances for driving under the influence, but they're still trying to develop the mechanisms for how you even detect if someone is under the influence, because the same breathalyzer that gets utilized for alcohol doesn't really work in this situation here as well. And so again, another point where we could have a family discussion and conversation about that. Sister Pam Hunter, Assemblywoman Pam Hunter in Syracuse, has a bill with respect to the surcharges and fines within our court system, particularly how it affects you losing the access to your driver's license, and how when you live upstate, like areas like Syracuse, you need your driver's license in order to participate in the economy and what that looks like. And so again, I want to highlight another piece of legislation that we can all get behind. I think this is a point in time where this is a really and true day of reckoning. I am honored again to be, here in this space and in this time. Critical race theory is real, and now that Juneteenth is a thing. Thanks to my sister Assemblywoman Alicia Hyman, it's now a state holiday. And I'll never forget the day when, we were celebrating Juneteenth in the state capitol, and we took pieces of kente cloth, and, individuals were draped in their kente stoles, and it was across racial and it was an intergenerational participation, and it was a beautiful thing, and it was a beautiful thing to be able to witness, even in the face where we're even on sometimes different political sides, but the recognition of where we are in this day and the role that we've played and our ancestors have played with respect to the greatness of America. And so, we're not, who cares about making America great again? We are still great, and we will always be great, and we can only get greater. And one of those things that really will allow us to be in that position is just to recognize that we all play a role in the body politic of the greatness of America. And it's not until we accept that and we acknowledge the awesomeness of being Black in America, will we ever get to the point where we can fully participate. People talk all the time about like Black girl magic. We don't walk around with any magic or secret pixie dust that we sprinkle over situations, over places, people, and things. It's about the hard work, the perseverance, the dedication, and the commitment that we have that really allows and lends for all of the successes that we have been able to attain. And again, I really appreciate Attorney Ken Montgomery for participating in this space, because he always has, he always is, and he really is always someone who has his finger on the pulse. Thank you, Yolan.
Thank you.
Yolan had mentioned that she fights as hard as you fight in the criminal court, she fights in the foreclosure court. And so again, as they try to take away our power and our liberty, they also try to take away our wealth. And so Yolan stands in the gap with respect to that. And so we thank you and we honor you as well. And thank you to all of the folks who are here. And so we will continue along tomorrow night. We will meet at 7 p.m., same place. And we're going to be talking about the power of our vote, and looking at where we are from Reconstruction to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and to gaining and allowing people who are presently on parole to register to vote and to participate in that, and how we need to go down all across the country and change those dynamics. We also have a 1 p.m. Zoom as well, where we will be focusing on education. And so I invite you to come back and take this journey with us. We're taking a leap of faith here, and a leap of faith really just requires, that there has to be some community buy-in, because we're going to change some things, and we're not coming out here to take the door off the we're not coming out here to knock the door down. We want to take the door off the hinges so that they can never put it back on again. And we're dismantling systems, operations, and things that are designed to keep us down. Again, thank you so much. I'm ready. I'm hyped. I'm powered up, and I'm ready to go.
Good evening, everybody. Have a nice evening. See you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, and let's continue on these family conversations, as the Assemblywoman so aptly called it. Good evening.